Welcome back, OU. Once again, my name is Taryn, and I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I'm so excited to be here with you talking about how we can care for our marriage during this pandemic, during COVID-19. And today we're going to be talking about what it looks like to be thoughtful together. I want to start off by saying I think most of us would say that we think we are thoughtful. I'm a thoughtful person. I know how to care for others. I know how to be conscientious or kind or considerate of others. And in general, that's probably true. What I'm talking about today, though, specifically in the context of marriage, is how am I specifically being thoughtful about my spouse, about the information that I am privy to that other people just aren't because they're not in our marriage. And so we're going to work on promoting thoughtfulness and doing this together. And so, there's a difference between thinking I'm being thoughtful and actually being thoughtful. And what this looks like and actually being thoughtful looks like truly knowing my spouse, number one, knowing what they like, dislike, knowing what bothers them, knowing what's painful, knowing what their dreams are. Last week we talked about dreams and sharing goals, knowing what those dreams are, knowing what gives them purpose, and then actually communicating what I know. And I think we can know often a lot about our spouse, but not actually communicate or demonstrate what I know about them. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're constantly being provided new information, okay? No matter how long you've been together, no matter if you've been together for 6 months or 50 years, you are constantly learning new stuff about your spouse. We change, we grow, we learn, we figure out new stuff about ourselves. And so we want to practice under this premise that my partner is the teacher and I'm the student. And I'm not just any old student who doesn't like school and doesn't want to learn this topic, but I'm open and I'm curious. So we're going to take this perspective of being open and curious throughout this session today. I also, want to know that my partner's needs are probably different than my own. So what they have communicated to me in the past about what's difficult for them and what they might need is not going to be what I need. And so very often we think we're being thoughtful because I'm caring for you in the way that I wish to be cared for. If any of you have read the 5 love languages, right? That's one way, one tool, or one resource that we can use to actually learn how to love our spouse well because we know how they've communicated they want to be loved. But it is important first that we know our spouse and that we then know if it's different, if they need to be cared for and thought of differently. When looking at my spouse, I do want to understand. A wise person once told me that most of the time your spouse is not attempting to be malicious toward you when they hurt you, when they do something inconsiderate. They're just being thoughtless, okay? They're just not thinking of you or thinking about what you might need or what you've communicated with them in the past. And so instead of having this perspective of, well, they probably did that on purpose or how dare they, which leads to more negativity in the marriage or relationship, we're just going to think of it as thoughtlessness, okay? When my spouse hurts me, they're probably just being thoughtless. And then this perspective does help me create a more positive environment for my marriage to grow and develop. And so ultimately, I'm giving my spouse the benefit of the doubt more often because I see the ways in which they're being thoughtless. So how is thoughtlessness actually hurtful? Well, it doesn't express that I really know much about my spouse, my knowledge of them. It doesn't express that I've been listening, that I've been paying attention. It doesn't demonstrate that my spouse is valuable enough to me, even if I know stuff about them, that they're valuable enough to me to be an expert on them, to have remained open and curious to what they might have been sharing with me. This is both verbally and non-verbally. This is what I've observed. Okay, this is just sharing space together. What have I noticed? During this pandemic, I think, it would be pretty typical to notice that potentially, because of the stress of the situation, your spouse might be acting a little differently than they would typically be acting, or maybe they're acting the way they typically act when they're stressed out. Maybe they're not really sure how to cope with our current circumstances. And so to be open, to be present, to be aware means to be thoughtful about your observations of them. And then in marriage, I think one of the greatest privileges that we have is to be able to truly know your spouse, to know their true self, to know what excites them, to know what they're passionate about, to know what saddens them, to know if they have any convictions that are really important for you to be aware of and know, and to know what they believe, to know what they value. So, mishandling this really sensitive and special information can be incredibly painful. Once again, you are the only one, I mean, maybe not the only one, but the best person in their life to handle this information and be thoughtful about what they're sharing with you. So, ways in which we're going to attempt to practice thoughtfulness during COVID, if you're following along. Um, I think the most basic way that we can be thoughtful is to extend grace to our partner or our spouse when they slip up, especially during this pandemic, to remember that they're not being malicious, but that we're in the middle of a pandemic and, maybe they don't know how to handle a situation that's come up because it looks differently. An example that I often use with couples is talking about a complaint of someone who commits and says that they're going to take out the trash, that's going to be kind of their chore or their task, but they haven't taken out the trash, right? And obviously, right, if my spouse has committed to do that and they don't do that, then, that's a complaint that I have. Like, hey, you said you were going to do this. Okay, they're not being malicious, probably just being thoughtless. And so, one way in which I can extend grace to them is to focus on my language when I communicate that complaint. So, I don't like to use words or try not to use words like, well, you never or you always do this or don't do this, right? So, a complaint that I could have, in this moment, if I were to not think about being thoughtful, would be to say, well, you never do what you say you're going to do. Like, you don't take out the trash. When in reality, most of the time they probably do. Or even if most of the time they don't, there have probably been a few times that they did actually take out the trash, right? And so that's a kind of a silly example, but it's one way in which we can talk about the language that we use in order to be thoughtful during this pandemic and to extend grace to your spouse. A more thoughtful response could simply be, I know it's been a busy week. I know things have been challenging. I can tell you are stressed out. To let them know, you see them, right? You're noticing them. Do you need me to take out the trash, or do you still have it? And they might say, no, I've still got it. Thanks for not blowing up at me or getting upset. And just reminding yourself, we all feel a little off to some extent, I think, right now. And so when we go ahead and we put that back into perspective to know grace is probably the number one thing that we need as a whole right now, especially at home. For those of you who have, I think we're moving out of a stage of being quarantined or stuck at home together. Things have started to open back up, school's back in session. But there was a period of time there for a little while where we were stuck together in the same house, most of us at least. And so to think about what the other is potentially feeling and ways in which we can be kind to them just because of the time that's important. And then paying attention to the information that is already there. So you might say, well, my spouse doesn't really tell me what they need, or they're not very good at communicating what they're feeling. Um, and I really just don't know. And so I'm not really sure how to be thoughtful. I promise you there is some information there. I promise you that if you were to pause and observe, you might not get it right. You might have to ask for clarification later on, like, hey, I noticed you do this. Is this what you're feeling right now? Is this what you need from me? You might have to ask for that clarification, but typically the information is there. So if we're functioning under the perspective that my spouse is the teacher and I'm the student and I'm attempting to learn from them, then I am looking for ways in which I can jump in and do something that seems thoughtful, seems loving. And just communicating then that you know them. So asking thoughtful questions. Often there are moments where my husband will start to share something with me and I don't realize I'm doing the dishes, or I'm feeding the dog, or, I'm distracted. I'm on my phone. Uh, I don't notice that he's attempting to share something with me that is important to him. And so sometimes it takes my husband kind of looking at me and saying, Taryn, I'm sharing something important with you, right? And being direct with me. But other times I'm able to, after a while of seeing that he's getting frustrated with me, put down my phone, turn off the water to the sink, and turn and look at him and say, hey, I'm sorry. I know you were sharing something with me. You have my full attention. I'm listening. What is it that you wanted to share? And then asking thoughtful questions about that, asking your spouse to elaborate, asking questions like, well, that, what was that like for you? Taking notes to use. Sometimes I actually set reminders in my phone to remind me to pay attention to my spouse, to put my phone down, to say, at this hour, I'm going to set my phone down and I'm going to give my husband 100% my attention. And that's just kind of a rule that we have talked about and we've created together. And once we set those reminders, I think, we can truly say, hey, I've heard your complaint in the past. Here's what I've done. Here's the action that I've taken. And I just, I want you to know that I'm going to be intentional to love you in this way and to be thoughtful in this way. So the best way to be thoughtful is to ask your spouse, how can I be thoughtful? Okay, and once again, I think I said this the last session, it is easy to focus on what our spouse is not doing and the ways in which they're hurting me, or the ways in which I feel like my spouse is being thoughtless. But what I really want to focus on here is how I can be thoughtful, how I can work to pull from that data bank or that information bank of what I know about my spouse and do things based on what I know about them, not just what I think they need or how I think they need to be loved or cared for. You're going to fail. That's the point. On a day-to-day basis, you're probably going to do something that hurts your spouse. And so I think even being able to acknowledge that when it's brought up and say, I'm sorry, I was thoughtless, I wasn't considering you and your perspective or what you've shared with me in the past about this. That's thoughtful. Being able to take responsibility and stop and say, I messed up. So we're going to work on being more thoughtful. I think it's something that is a lot more challenging to practice than to talk about. But stop and think about ways in which you can be thoughtful with your spouse this week. If you're unsure what that actually looks like, maybe ask them the question, What would let you know that I'm thinking of you throughout the week? What would let you know that I'm thinking of you, being mindful of you throughout this pandemic? Is there anything that I'm not doing that you currently need? Giving feedback or getting feedback is necessary as we're caring for our marriage. So I encourage you to do that. Be kind to each other as you share. Be thoughtful to each other as you share. And I'll see you next time.